We had gotten down to verse 27, and I believe that we mentioned the aspect of the idea of once to die shows that reincarnation is false. But I ask the question, why is this even here? And here it's talking about Christ having to suffer since the foundation of the world. But then, once in the end of the world, hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, judgment. Why does he even mention the aspect of this?
You need to be prepared. No second chance.
Why mention that in the middle of this?
Well, Christ died for remission of sin, to remit people's sins, or give them the opportunity, and sin condemns. The wages is death, and so you don't want to experience death. So, wouldn't that be the reason?
No.
Nope. Why not? Okay, you explain.
Well, it goes to kind of the parallel with Christ sacrificing himself once, and it's giving them an example of something that they know.
You're getting a whole lot closer now.
Because of the rollover of the sins every year.
They had to do what because of that?
They had to go back once a year to
Sacrifice.
So he's making a contrast. He's showing that that's being done away with.
Well, the sacrifices are being done away with, but he's talking about Christ. Notice verse 28, so Christ. In what regard? Well, as opposed to the constant sacrifices of the Old Testament, Christ had to die once. It's appointed unto man once to die, not many times. There's the reason that it's in there. It's not really talking about our death, that it's appointed unto man, you and I, once to die. He's talking about Christ.
So he's talking about Christ dying on the cross?
Yes, that he died once. He didn't have to die many times. In fact, by the very nature of man, he could not have.
But he uses the word men, M-E-A, or men.
Wasn't Christ a man?
Yeah.
Didn't he become man?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay, in becoming man, what did he have to do? He had to die. How many times? Once.
Well, why was that last phrase on there? After this is judgment?
Okay.
What did that have to do with Christ?
Good question. That's what we're going to get into now. But after this, after death, judgment. Literally, not the judgment, but literally is after this, judgment. Is there more than one type of judgment?
Yeah, the judgment on Christ.
Well,
as a sin bearer.
Yeah.
Well, if like the one that wanted Lazarus to come and preach him. I mean, from what we do, we're judged.
But
in
that's
this life when we die, and then there's going to be during the resurrection a final.
The final judgment. But isn't there other types of judgment other than that? Yeah. Is that the only judgment that there is?
Like Isaiah 13 to 23, lots of judgments.
Yeah, there's a bunch of judgments. Okay. We come down to verse 28. So Christ, what? Well, Christ in becoming man. And that's what he has established here in the book of Hebrews, that Christ became man. You can go back to Hebrews 2 and verse 17, for example. Well, what did Christ have to do in becoming man? He had to die. What comes after death? Judgment. What was the judgment in relationship to Christ, or in relationship to Jesus.
That he is the Christ. He resurrected from the dead.
That he is the Christ, the Son of God. And we won't take the time this morning, but tie in with this and study Romans 1 and verse 4. That he was proved to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection. What is it? God was judging him. And in that, he raised him from the dead, which showed what? He is my Son, which is, again, the subject of Hebrews, the first couple of chapters. He is my Son. What is it? He's the Christ, the Son of the living God. Also state 1 Peter 3 and verse 22. And Matthew 16:18. Upon this rock I will build my church. Acts 2, verse 22 through 36. Am I going too fast? Acts 2, 22 through 36. So here, the discussion, if you go back into verse 25. Nor yet that he should offer himself often. See, there's the contrast that's being made. As the high priest entereth into the holy place every year with the blood of others, for then he must have suffered since the foundation of the world. But now once in the end of the age, or the consummation of the age, hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. As it is appointed unto man once to die, and after this judgment, so Christ was offered to bear the sins of many. In other words, he died, and then he was judged as the one who can bear the sins, our sins. What is it? He is judged as the Christ, the Son of God. And unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation. Unto them that look for him. How many of us really look for the coming of Christ? It's kind of we don't really like to, do we, at times? We've got so much to do here, we've got this to do and that to do, and it kind of gets pushed out. We don't want to look for the second coming.
1 John 3:3, and every man that hath this hope purifieth himself even as he is pure.
Okay. I don't see the tie-in myself. It's
about the hope. And
well, it's our attitude here that is being discussed. Our hope, or not our hope, but the attitude of looking for him to come, an expectation, a desire for his coming. And I think that a lot of us, at times, yes, we do, but most of the time that kind of gets pushed out of the way. But that's a whole sermon you could preach on that. So, unto them that look for him will he appear the second time without sin. Again, we're dealing with a contrast here. Go back to, again, verse 25. Here's the high priest. He himself, the high priest, entered the holy place every year with the blood of others. And then what would he do? Yeah, but did he stay in that most holy place? No. What did he do? He had to come out. What happened? Well, was he cleansed when he came out?
First.
Not really. He had to come out of that most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, but he still had sin. Christ will appear without sin. The first advent of Jesus was to offer himself as a burden bearer, sin bearer, bearing our sins upon himself, his death upon the cross. The question that is raised here and that I have in relationship to this is this appearing. Is it referring to his appearance in heaven, in the holies, without sin for our salvation, which would be consistent with the context? Or is it talking about his second coming at the end of the world, where we would be receiving the end of our faith, even the salvation of our soul, as it's put in 1 Peter 1, verse 9? Well, that would be harmonious with everything that's being discussed as well. I think it could refer to either one myself, but I don't think it really makes that much difference as to which one it's referring to, because both of them are scriptural ideas. So now then, chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, is the impossibility of the old to take away sin. Remember, as we study this, the Bible was not divided up into chapters and verses when it was written. Chapter 10 is a continuation of chapter 9. And in some ways it is an injustice to us to have a chapter division here. But I sure would have hated to try and do all that work and not have them available to us today, but they do an injustice at times.
So what would you do? Go to the first place in the chapter 9 and find out where the law is mentioned, tie it in with the first mention of the law in chapter 10? That would be the way you would handle the context?
I'm not following you. It just...
It would go to verse 18, and then verse 19 kind of starts anew.
Well, just look at the outline that I gave you, and you'll see how this is a part of that context that goes back to, let's see, what was it? I don't want to scroll, but 9:16. It goes back there. So really that's the whole context, starting the context at 9:16. But this is just a continuation of the thoughts. In fact, the word "for" here, for the law, having a shadow of good things to come and not the very image of the things, can never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually make the comers thereunto perfect. See, it's the same discussion, not a different discussion. The word "for" here is the Greek word gar, G-A-R. And it is an explanation of what has gone before. You might say, here's the reason of all of this. And it's, within the context here, it's a further explanation of the one sacrifice of the Messiah, as opposed to the multiple sacrifices of the old law. The law, at this point, the law and the priesthood are viewed together, inseparably. Just as the law of Christ cannot be separated from the blood of Christ, and his priesthood and his sonship, which we'll probably talk about next week a little bit more. So with the Old Testament law and the sacrifices of the Old Testament law and the priesthood, you cannot view them separately. They are interchangeable. They are together. And you have to look at them together. The word shadow, for the law having a shadow of good things to come, is from a word which actually means shadow. Shadow actually is, and literally is, the breaking of light. You've broken the light. And that breaking of light produces a shadow.
Wouldn't the light be, I ran references in Matthew 20, from something like Numbers 24:17, that talks about the light of Christ, or the Son of Righteousness, and Malachi 4, who have ran references on this?
No.
He would be the Son of Righteousness, that'd be light, right?
That has nothing to do with
Nothing to do
this.
with it?
No.
Okay.
You're dealing with, here is a shadow. What is a shadow? Well, you have light, a light of some type, and a shadow is produced by the breaking of that light. Light has a path.
He's the light of the world, though, so I just confused.
So what? That doesn't, I mean, it has nothing to do with being a shadow and the production of a shadow. That's what we're talking about.
What is the shadow of
The
light?
breaking of a light.
Right. Where does the light come from?
The sun, a light fixture or light bulb,
Yeah, well, what's not point?
And-
The light. I don't see why they don't like compare.
because how is, well, just move on, Dale.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
A shadow can either go, and we've mentioned this before or after. If the sun is, if I'm walking in a direction and the sun is behind me, my shadow is before me. It's preceding me. If I'm walking toward the sun, my shadow is behind me. The Old Testament is a shadow. But what did it do? It came before. Does that mean that it's the original? No. It's still the shadow, even though it came before, as far as time is concerned. The word image, which is the very image of the things, is a word which means more than just a likeness. It's both a representation and a manifestation. It's used in Matthew 22 and verse 20, where Jesus says, they've come to him, is it lawful to pay taxes unto Caesar? Show me a penny. Whose image and subscription is on it? They say Caesar's. Well, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God's. The image. It's a representation. Jesus represented God while he was here upon this earth. But it's more than just simply a representation. It is also a manifestation. He was representing God, but he was also God with us. And so he was the manifestation of God as well as the representation of God. And thus he would tell the apostles, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Why? Because he was representing the Father, but he was also God. So that's what I mean by both a representation and a manifestation. And that's embraced in this word image. So these Old Testament things were not the very image of the things. They were just a shadow of those good things to come. And those sacrifices that they offered every year could not make the comers thereunto perfect. Word perfect, we've looked at this word many times. It's teleoo. And it means to bring to a state of completion. The sacrifices they offered could not make the comers thereunto complete, could not bring them to completion. In what regard? Salvation and the forgiveness of their sins. So verse 2, For then would they not have ceased to be offered? Because that the worshippers, once purged, should have no more conscience of sins. The word then, for then, goes back to the sacrifices making the comers thereunto perfect. If the sacrifices could have made them perfect, they would have ceased to be offered. They would have stopped offering them. They would not have to do it every year. But the very fact that they had to continue to offer those sacrifices showed that they were not complete. They did not have true forgiveness of their sins. They were still under their sin, under that Old Testament law, and under that Old Testament system. But in those sacrifices, there is a remembrance again made of sins every year. Remembrance is from a Greek word which means a calling to mind, a recollection, or a remembrance. What is the Lord's Supper?
Something that shows the Lord's death till He comes.
It is a remembrance of the Lord's death till He comes. A calling to mind, a recollection of His death. And we do that till He comes. That's the same word that's used here. It is there is a remembrance again made of sins every year. And so, whether it's in the mind of God or the people or both, God called to the people's mind, He called to His mind all those sins that they'd committed. There's a remembrance again of all of those sins. Now then, this idea is also, we go back into chapter 9 and verse 7. Unto the second went the high priest alone every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. What is it? Every year. They had to go in and offer sacrifices for the errors of the people. Why? Because there is a remembrance again of all those sins. Let's get down in chapter 10 and verse 11 and also verse 18, and we see the same principles being set forth.
What were the errors of the people verse you changed reference to?
Chapter 9 and verse 7. So there's a remembrance made of them every year. Why? For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sin. Should we ask, and as so many times we get the question, why? Why couldn't the blood of bulls and goats? Why did Christ have to die? Couldn't God have done it some other way? Don't give me that dirty look.
That's
What?
the whole reason for Christ on the earth.
But couldn't God have decided some other way?
He didn't.
How many times? I don't know how many times through the year that I've been asked that question.
You don't have an answer?
The only answer I have is because God said so. Which really isn't that much of an answer, is it? Not in our minds, at least.
You don't have a chain reference. You can go through and explain it.
It's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats take away sin. That's all you can really say.
Proves His love for mankind.
Well, it does. It does a lot of those things, but you go back again, and here they keep asking, well, why though? Couldn't He have done it some other way? Couldn't He have shown His love some other way? And other than giving His only begotten Son? But
That's the greatest expression of love. That's the greatest.
Couldn't he have saved us some other way other than the death of his son? Well, God said it's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sin. Yet we know from the Bible salvation is by blood. Matthew 26:28, Acts 20 and verse 28. And we could tie in a lot more passages, but we know salvation is by blood. And thus it takes blood, but why couldn't the blood of bulls and goats do it? Because God said it couldn't.
We don't ask questions of God, we just do it.
Well,
It's not for us to ask.
God just said it. We accept what He says. We may not understand everything. For us to try and judge God and His decision on things is rather presumptuous of man. But to ask why, sure, what's wrong with that? But God doesn't really give us an answer.
As Ray Fushi would say, that's a Deuteronomy 29:20.
Well, that may be, yes. Who can know the mind of God?
Isaiah 55:8-9.
Well, that's what I was having reference to, Isaiah 55:8-9. Regarding the blood of bulls and goats, and you might consider Micah 6 verses 6 through 8, where he writes, "Wherewith shall I come before Jehovah and bow myself unto the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings and calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams or 10,000 livers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body, the sin of my soul? He has showed thee, O man, what is good. What doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God?" Blood of bulls and goats couldn't take away sins. That's what he's saying here. Verses 5 through 18 then. The sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice. And we see in verses 5 through 10 that Christ volunteers to be the sacrifice. And now in verses 5 and 6, that God prepared him a body. Wherefore, when he cometh into the world, he saith, "Sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not, but a body hast thou prepared me."
And verse 5 answers the question we asked a while ago. When you think about it, look at it.
It doesn't answer the question as to why.
Oh, it don't? It says he would us or desires not burn offering and sacrifice.
But that doesn't answer the question, why couldn't God have done it some other way? I don't know. God said this is the way. That's the only answer that we have. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast no pleasure. Then said I, Lo, I come. In the volume of the book it is written of me to do thy will, O God. These verses really recorded in Psalm the 40th chapter, or the 40th Psalm, verses 6 through verse 8. So David said this in those verses. If you go back to those verses and into the 40th Psalm, David uttered this in appreciation for God's deliverance from his persecutors. And so he's saying, what can I offer unto God in appreciation for the deliverance that he has given me? Now here again, the 40th Psalm is dealing with specifically his deliverance from enemies. Now then, as the New Testament does, it takes it and makes spiritual application of it. And as so many times, using David's statements. You see that a great deal in Hebrews, in fact. But sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not. Didn't God want sacrifice and offerings? Didn't He command sacrifice and offerings? Then how in the world could David, and thus now Paul, say that that's not what he wanted? Thou wouldest not. If God commanded them, why wouldn't He want them? Think.
We don't have to make those sacrifices.
Well, David would have, wouldn't he? And it's a quote from David.
Why don't you tell us?
Why is this being written? What's the subject? What's the context?
Well, the contrast between offering habitually and a one-time offering.
The sacrifices of the old covenant, sacrifice of Christ. What about those sacrifices of the old covenant?
It couldn't make sins away.
Could not take away sin. Something else was demanded. Something greater than those sacrifices was demanded. So, sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not. They could not take away the sins. Something greater than those sacrifices had to be offered. Even with David, would it have satisfied God if David just made the sacrifices and offerings without anything else?
No, he needed a humble heart to go along with it.
Okay. He had to have something else. He had to have a lifestyle of thankfulness to God within the context of that deliverance from his enemies. He had to live a certain way. And so the sacrifice and offering was not sufficient in itself. There had to be something else. That's what David is emphasizing. That's what we're seeing here. And so what was demanded? David gave himself as a slave. His body. A body you've prepared for him. A body of what? To be in service and in slavery to God. That's what you prepared for. So the sacrifice and offering is not sufficient. There's a body that was needed to be in sacrificial to God.
Tie in here.
Is what?
Make your body a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God. Tie in.
Well, if you're applying it to David, yes, it would. And for us today. But now then, the Hebrews writer is taking that and appropriating it for Jesus. Sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not. In other words, the blood of bulls and goats was not sufficient to take away sin. What was necessary? A body thou hast prepared for me. And there's a lot of other passages we could tie in with this, but go back to, or look at verse 6 as well. Burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast had no pleasure. Didn't God have pleasure in them? Well, obviously He did, because He commanded them to be offered. Have to keep everything in context, though. What's the discussion here? Forgiveness of sins. Sacrifices and offerings for sin, they could not take away sin. Thus, God did not have pleasure in them. Now, if you say God had pleasure in them, yes, He did, because He commanded them. They had to do it in order to be pleasing to God. But they could not take away sin. And in that aspect, he had no pleasure in them. And so what was necessary? A body. So when Jesus comes into the world, he needed a physical body. That physical body was necessary so that he could offer himself as a slave. And that's where we get into Philippians 2, verses 5 through 9. Or 6 through 9, really. That physical body was necessary so that he could die the death of the cross. That physical body was necessary and is prepared for him to be obedient to God in that physical body. Just as that's David's point, I have to be obedient to God, not just offer sacrifices. The offering of sacrifices would mean nothing if he didn't live according to God's will. So Paul is saying in relationship to Christ, God has prepared a body for Jesus. Why? So that he could die the death of the cross, but also so that he could live in an acceptable way to God. To obey God in his life. And then to offer it in contrast to the animal sacrifices. And his offering would be a final offering for sin. In that body he would have pleasure. Where he would not have pleasure in the blood of bulls and goats. Why? Because they couldn't take away sin, and Christ's body could. Now then, I'll mention very briefly here, and I'll probably mention it again later. Paul in this section really uses the body of Christ and the blood of Christ interchangeably. They're the same. You might compare that with the Lord's Supper. But, as I say, we'll come back to that probably. So, in verse 7, since we kind of took 5 and 6 together, verse 7, then said I, lo, I come in the volume of the book. It is written of me to do thy will, O God. The word volume, well, I-O-N. Now what do you get out of that? Bible. Biblion. It literally means book. But it's the word that we get Bible from.
Would I-O-N be the suffix? What would that?
Well, that's the ending. When you're dealing with the Greek language, the ending tells you how a word is used. And whether it's the subject of the sentence, whether it's the verb, what type of verb it is, or whether it's a direct object, or whether it's an adjective or adverb. Those things are determined not where they are in the sentence, like English is so many times. It's by the ending of the word. And so, well, one that you'll know, agape. Well, the ending is a noun, but if you want it to be a verb, agapao. And then you go from there as to different endings, and from nouns it's called declensions, and in verbs it's called conjugations. But it's the same word, it's just a different ending that tells you whether it's a noun, verb, and what type of noun or what type of verb. So So when you say suffix, well, no, it's not a suffix. It's just the ending that's going to tell you what it is.
So Bible would be a transliteration, right?
To a certain extent, it is. It literally means, and even the English word Bible literally means book. And there's the Holy Bible, but then, Jim, you might know the Shooter's Bible. See, I remember my dad getting that years ago.
Who Bible?
Shooters.
Shooters.
All the guns in the world.
What does that have to do?
Talks about all the guns. Shooting guns.
Oh, yeah.
Shooter's Bible. It was the book about shooting.
That was Christ, what kind they are, and what quality they are, there's nothing more about it.
Yep, everything about it. That's why it was called the Shooter's Bible, because it was the book on shooting. Guns and I think ammunition as well, wasn't it? So, but here the word volume is that Greek word biblion, Bible. The Old Testament, thus, he's dealing with the Old Testament in the volume of thy book. It is written of me to do thy will. He is saying that the Old Testament gave the instructions regarding God's will for the Messiah. How many times have we emphasized the prophecies of the Old Testament? Anyone remember about how many prophecies there were concerning the Messiah?
About 300 and some odd.
Okay. We generally refer to it as over 300. Some say over 300 or about 330. So, what is it? Here's the volume of thy book giving instructions concerning the Messiah and everything about his life. In verse 8 then, above when he said, a sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings and offering for sin thou wouldest not, neither hast pleasure in them, or neither hast pleasure therein, which are offered by the law. Above, when he said above, has reference back to verse 5. That when he cometh into the world, he saith, sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not, but a body thou hast prepared for him. When he said that, sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings and offering for sin thou wouldest not. He's explaining it. That God did not have pleasure in these things, which are offered by the law. And that goes back again to the aspect that they couldn't take away sin. So he didn't have pleasure in them. What was necessary? The sacrifice of Christ. Let me just mention, going back really to verse 5 through verse 7, you have parallelism, the parallelism of the Bible, or the poetry of the Bible is parallelism. First line, and I use line loosely there. First line says something, synonymous parallelism. The second line says the same thing in different words. Synthetic parallelism, first line says something, the second line adds to the thought of the first line. Antithetic is the first line says something, the second line says the opposite. So that's your parallelism of the Bible, or your poetry of the Bible. In verses 5 through 7, you have parallelism being presented for us. Dale?
It blows my mind how Christ could be omniscient, omnipresent, and yet be in Mary's womb. So apparently when he was in Mary's womb, he still had all that knowledge in him. And yet he was a baby. He knew what was in the man. I guess I'm mind-boggling.
There are things that we will never understand about that.